Welcome to part two of our webinar series, Building a Strong Preservation Program. My name is Laura Gamaid, and I'm the Program Specialist for the Certified Local Government Program in Texas. Part two will focus on building a strong historic preservation ordinance. Understanding the role and function of each tool is the first step towards having a successful preservation program. Preservation ordinances are a set of rules and regulations adopted by the community that outline the legal organization or structure of a preservation program. It allows cities to designate individual buildings or group of buildings, known as districts, provide protection from insensitive additions, create guidelines for alterations, establish a certificate of appropriateness review process, allow more time for the city and the public to review demolition permit applications. A city zoning ordinance is the local or municipal regulations and laws that define how properties in specific geographic zones can be used. Zoning ordinances specify whether zones can be used for residential or commercial purposes, and may also regulate lot size, placement, density, and the height of structures. Many cities will also identify their historic districts as an add-on to their underlying zoning code by amending their zoning maps to create a historic district overlay over the designated areas. Overlay districts are a zoning tool that can be used to focus on neighborhoods or areas that need additional regulations. An overlay district is a zoning district which is applied over one or more previously established zoning zones. Establishing additional or stricter standards and criteria for covered properties in addition to those of the underlying zoning district. Overlay districts can also be used to promote specific development projects, such as mixed-use development, waterfront development, housing along transit corridors, or affordable housing. Historic districts are often treated as overlay districts in Texas. To supplement their existing historic districts regulations, many cities have created a second type or resource district called a conservation district. Geared towards preserving the character rather than the historic fabric of existing neighborhoods, conservation districts are being considered or have been adopted in a growing number of jurisdictions across the United States as alternatives to more stringent historic districts regulations. Cities as varied as Galveston, Texas, Omaha, Nebraska, and Cambridge, Massachusetts have all adopted some form of conservation district. Many conservation districts have been implemented for areas that fall short of meeting the criteria for a local, state, or national historic designation, but nevertheless have important cultural, visual, or other significance. Some are intended as step-down buffer or transition areas immediately surrounding a protected historic district. Others are directed at preserving the residential character of a neighborhood, maintaining a unique community center, or emphasizing an important cultural element of a community. Conservation districts are typically established as either base districts or overlay districts within the local zoning ordinance. For instance, in 2010, Galveston established their first neighborhood conservation district in the San Jacinto neighborhood. As shown on this diagram, they identified front porches as an important building component in the neighborhood. Therefore, in their ordinance, they require all new residential construction in the district to provide this critical building element, and their NCD ordinance gives specific minimum standards that must be complied with. These include minimum depth, setbacks, width, and orientation of the porch. Unlike state and federal guidelines that must cover a wide range of cities and communities, a local preservation ordinance can be customized to fit the needs of the local community. The basic components of a historic preservation ordinance typically include a statement of purpose and definition of terms, identifies the historic preservation officer position, identify the landmark commission, their powers and duties, lists a criteria for designation of historic buildings and districts, establishes a review process, review standards, and appeal process, and establish demolition procedures. Several cities go beyond the basics and adopt bonus ordinances, such as design guidelines and/or standards, vacant building ordinance, demolition by neglect provisions, incentives, etc. We will be discussing some of these bonuses in depth further on in this webinar series. This presentation is structured into 7 parts that correspond with the general structure of a historic preservation ordinance. The first step is categorizing the needs of the community. The community must first identify the specific types of historic resources that should be protected by carefully evaluating the needs of the community. Here's where an updated survey is important. A historic resource survey will identify periods of importance in the community as well as specific landmarks and districts eligible for designation. For example, is your community rural or urban? An urban community will have different needs than a rural community. A rural community might focus on scattered individual landmarks, while an urban city might focus on designating historic districts, focusing on their use. Commercial districts are inherently more public versus residential districts, which deals primarily with private properties. These districts are typically reviewed differently, and depending on the community, the designation process may also differ. Two important issues that every preservation ordinance should address are new construction and demolition procedures. Whether they are occurring or not in your community, it is critical that the ordinance sets forth a review process and requirements for both new infill construction in districts and for demolition of significant structures. What does a preservation ordinance do? There are many misconceptions about historic preservation. A preservation ordinance does provide a municipal policy for the protection of historic properties, establish an objective and democratic process for designating these properties, protect the integrity of designated historic properties within a design review requirement, authorize design guidelines for new development within historic districts to ensure that it is not destructive to the area's historic character, and stabilize declining neighborhoods and protect and enhance property values. A preservation ordinance does not require that historic properties be open for tours. It does not restrict the sale of the property, does not restrict any modifications, alterations, or demolition. Rather, it requires a review process to take place. It does not require improvements, changes, or restoration of the property. It does not require approval of interior changes or alterations. It does not prevent new construction within historic areas, nor does it require approval for ordinary maintenance or repairs. A preservation ordinance also sets forth who will be responsible for administering the preservation ordinance. Members of a local landmark commission are typically appointed by the local governing body or chief executive, such as the city manager. Landmark commissions are typically made up of 5 to 9 members. An odd number helps prevent tie votes. Terms vary widely, with 3 years being a typical length. Terms usually are staggered to ensure that experienced members always will be serving, and additionally, some communities may want to consider setting a maximum limit on the number of consecutive terms that any person can serve. This prevents the commission from becoming too closely associated with any one individual. Another aspect that each jurisdiction should consider is whether to require professional qualifications for some or all members of the review board. Qualifications are important from both a legal and a practical standpoint. Currently, there are different approaches in use throughout the state. Some communities require that a few or all members be trained in history, architecture, archaeology, or a related field, in order to ensure that preservation decisions benefit from professional expertise. Other communities require no such qualifications and simply ask that members express an interest in preservation in order to serve. Best practice is to have a mix of professional experts and at-large citizens that either live in a historic district or own a designated landmark. A broadly based membership can protect the ordinance and its administration from a claim of arbitrariness and can help distinguish preservation restrictions from other aesthetic controls that are sometimes invalidated by the court. Some observers argue that the overall quality of preservation and design review in the community suffers if commission members do not have solid credentials and the experience necessary to carry out the responsibility. There is value in having a mix of backgrounds on a preservation commission. The city's historic preservation officer is the assigned staff person in charge of administering the historic preservation ordinance. The HPO is also appointed by the local governing body or chief executive. It is strongly recommended that the HPO meet the professional qualification standards set forth by the Secretary of the Interior, since they act as an advisor to both property owners and the commission. They're the local authority on preservation matters, and they are also charged with advising the governing body on preservation issues. Depending on your community, they're also charged with approving minor improvements on historic properties, advising property owners on the best treatment for their building, and recommend modifications to projects that can have a negative impact on their historic properties. All of which requires them to have some familiarity with construction drawings, preservation practices. The HPO also functions as the main advisor to the Landmark Commission. Therefore, think about your commission composition. If the commission does not have qualified professionals, they will rely more heavily on city staff to provide professional guidelines and recommendations. A common question we often get is, does listing in the National Register mean that your house or neighborhood or city's main street will be protected from time and change or preserved? Many people think so, and this is a common misunderstanding. As we discussed in our previous webinar in this series, Protection by Designation, while National Register listing is a tremendous honor and carries some financial opportunities as well, it does not offer any local protection from demolition or alteration. Similarly, state designation, known as State Antiquities Landmarks, or SALs, and Recorded Texas Historic Landmarks, RTHLs, have some protection at the state level. However, it does not give the city jurisdiction over these properties. A city's historic preservation ordinance has jurisdiction over locally designated landmarks and districts only. If there is no local historic districts or landmark, then the ordinance has no power over any property in the city. In order for the city to have jurisdiction over National Register districts, SALs or RTHLs, they must be locally designated. National Register designation is utilized by many cities nationwide as a way to introduce historic preservation to a city. It is recommended that National Register designation does not automatically result in local designation, since the national requirements might be less stringent than the local process. Take this map from the city of Miami Beach. The thick lines represent the National Register districts. The shaded areas are local districts. The local districts were adopted over several years and divide the larger National Register district into smaller, more concentrated local districts. However, National Register designation is not a prerequisite for local designation. For example, the light green shaded area is only a local historic district and was never in the National Register district. Most historic preservation ordinances use the National Register of Historic Places criteria, shown on this slide, to designate at the local level. However, some communities will customize the criteria. For example, in order for a building to be considered for the National Register, it must be at least 50 years old or more. Communities which were predominantly developed in the 20th century might find that some of their significant landmarks do not comply with this requirement, and will therefore not require the structure to be 50 years or more. The city of Nacogdoches designates based on this revised criteria. However, they added some additional criteria, such as if a building is associated with the lives of persons significant in the city's past, or if the building represents an established and familiar visual feature of the city. When designating districts, it is important to classify all structures located within the district boundaries. There are two common options to classify historic resources. One is simply to designate the resource as contributing or non-contributing. This option is used to classify structures in the National Register of Historic Places nomination. The buildings pictured here are from Fornesville, Texas. The two structures were similarly designed with decorative parapets, same window configuration, awning placement, and storefronts. However, one is considered contributing and the other one is non-contributing. The retention of original design, material, workmanship, windows, transoms, storefronts on the right has helped the Aston building retain its integrity, while the building on the left has lost its integrity since the materials and facade have been modified and a distinctive decorative parapet has been removed. The other option is to use a tiered system with a Class 1, Class 2, Class 3, or high, medium, low priority. This system has been used by many municipalities since this allows for more varied type of preservation, since if desired, each class may have different regulations. A higher degree of review and control can be assigned over more significant properties, while correspondingly less review and control can be assigned to less significant properties. The Landmark Commission may be granted the authority to deny demolition of a designated historic resource, yet merely delay demolition of buildings that are not locally listed but are considered eligible for listing. To ensure efficient use of time by both staff and the Landmark Commission, the tiered review system graduates the level of review and regulation control according to the significance of the resource. The classification is usually assigned at the time of the historic resource survey. If this system is utilized, it is strongly recommended to keep your city survey up to date. A tier system can improve efficiency and add predictability to the review process. On the other hand, many communities do fine by assigning the same level of review to all historical resources, provided that there's sufficient staff to administer the ordinance. For example, Fredericksburg has a preservation priority rating. The three-tier rating system was used in the 2005 Fredericksburg Historic Resource Survey to evaluate all properties within and adjoining to the city's historic district. It is based upon current determinations of architectural value and integrity, and if known historical and cultural value. The high rating is for the most significant properties identified and are considered to be outstanding, unique, or good examples of architecture, engineering, or design. Properties designated with a high rating are to be the most protected from alteration and demolition. The medium rating properties may or may not be identified as architecturally significant on an individual basis, but are nonetheless valuable resources that add to the historic district's overall character. Properties designated with a medium rating shall be protected from demolition and where possible will be required or encouraged to maintain or improve architectural features. The low rating properties that minimally enhance the district's ability to convey a sense of time and place. These properties or improvements with a low rating may be considered for relocation or demolition upon a determination by Landmark Commission that the same can be accomplished with little or no consequence to the historic, cultural, architectural, or archaeological character of the district or property. Local historic districts are one of the oldest and strongest form of protection for historic properties. They protect historic buildings and their settings by establishing a public review process. A regulatory landmark commission is a key component of a successful historic preservation program. In Texas, Chapter 211 of the Local Government Code gives cities the ability to designate. For example, New Orleans established the first Bucqueray Commission in 1925 under pressure from the local chapter of the American Institute of Architects. The Bucqueray Commission oversaw all areas located within the French Quarter. This first commission faltered because the agency was merely advisory in function. It wasn't until an amendment to the Louisiana Constitution in 1936 that the city adopted a local ordinance that set standards to regulate changes. The subsequent commission of 1936 provided teeth and paralleled land use regulations. Today, some 60 years later, over 2,300 U.S. communities have adopted preservation ordinance, and the list is growing. The Historic Preservation Ordinance sets forth the criteria for the review of alterations, additions, and new constructions in a historic district. This criteria is based on the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. As with the National Register of Historic Places criteria for designation, cities throughout the nation use the Secretary of the Interior standards as the basis for reviewing all projects in their historic districts and/or landmarks. The local review criteria should set minimum standards for reviewing the massing, scale, aesthetics, materials, location, safety, and function of any new or existing structure, public spaces, and physical attributes of the project in relation to the site, adjacent structures and properties, and surrounding community. Stay tuned for a more detailed webinar on using the criteria. To what extent, if any, should responsibility under the Preservation Ordinance be delegated to full-time administrative staff as opposed to the Landmark Commission or some other elected or appointed review board? Nationwide, it is extremely common for landmark commissions to delegate authority for minor decisions to professional staff. This is often done to streamline the review process and liberate the Landmark Commission's time to work on more long-range and/or controversial issues. For example, staff may be given the authority to approve certificate of appropriateness for minor alterations to designated structures such as signs, paint, change of roofing or siding material for the same type, etc. Delegating minor repairs to a professional staff can also encourage ordinary maintenance of historic structures. If every minor improvement requires commission approval, it can discourage property owners to maintain their historic structures, especially if the commission only meets infrequently. Your city's historic preservation ordinance should also specify the application process for an application going before the Landmark Commission. The main procedural elements that should be included in any local preservation ordinance includes the applicability of the review process and criteria, for example, types of projects, what exceptions exist in the city, the basic process, initiation, timing, noticing requirements, content of an application, such as signatures, disclosures, description of the project, plans, photographs, etc., the criteria or source of criteria to be applied. For example, the Commission shall review all applications for consistency with the Secretary of the Interior standards and any design guidelines or standards, and any specific powers, such as conditional permit approval deemed appropriate for the certification process. The topic of demolition is a sensitive topic in most municipalities, and usually the biggest objection to preservation. Therefore, the demolition section of the ordinance is the most crucial and important section of a historic preservation ordinance. Should the ordinance merely require delays prior to the demolition of historical resources, or should the community be allowed to deny demolition? Experience throughout the nation demonstrates that without the ability to say no to proposed projects when necessary, a community will probably not have an effective preservation ordinance. Being able to turn down projects strengthens the Preservation Commission's hand in negotiations with property owners and is an approach that has been highly effective in other cities with strong preservation ordinances. Many communities with effective preservation programs allow their commission to deny alteration projects and demolition proposals that have been incompatible with the goal of the preservation program. The Certified Local Government Program requires cities to have a minimum of 60-day delay for demolition applications in order to give the city, the commission, and the property owners time to carefully review the property and make sure that all other options have been considered are not feasible. Other tools available to communities are demolition by neglect or vacant property ordinances. Demolition by neglect refers to the gradual deterioration of a property when routine or minimum maintenance is not performed. The HPO and the Development Service Department staff should work together in an effort to reduce demolition by neglect, involving landmarks or properties located within districts within the city. A demolition by neglect citation, as determined by the Landmark Commission, may be issued against the owner of a property for failure to comply with the minimum maintenance standards by permitting the subject property to exhibit serious disrepair or significant deterioration. Setting up minimum maintenance standards and enforcing these standards can help to prevent demolition by neglect. How should the ordinance be administered and enforced? Some communities find that the enforcement of local controls, particularly in large districts, cause some serious administrative headaches. It is simply too expensive and time-consuming to keep an eye on designated historic resources to make sure the local law is being observed by owners. Thus, in drafting enforcement provisions of an ordinance, one should keep in mind several major issues, including remedies for noncompliance, maintenance and upkeep requirements, and ordinance administration. The ordinance should be drafted to meet the goals of legal defensibility, effectiveness, administrative efficiency, and fairness to parties involved in the process. A preservation ordinance would only be as effective as the power and willingness of the community to enforce it. Ignoring the details of enforcement when drafting a local ordinance may have unfortunate circumstances. Look at your own city's policies and tools for regulating zoning and land use regulations. Is there a system in place? Can they be adopted to enforce the preservation ordinance? Build relationships and educate other cities' departments, such as building inspectors and code enforcement officers. They can be your eyes and ears in your historic areas. These departments should have up-to-date historic districts map. They can also educate property and business owners on any design requirements or approval process. Preventing non-compliance before it happens should be the city's best practice. The city attorney or chief legal counsel should be part of drafting or reviewing the ordinance. They will be the commission's representative if the decision is appealed. It is important to have an appeal process written into your local historic preservation ordinance. The appeal process should include deadlines, noticing requirements, and the timeline of the process. It should also specify who will be reviewing the appeal applications. In most cities, the application is heard by the city's planning commission or the Board of Adjustment. However, some cities create separate appeal boards. For example, Houston, our newest CLG, created the Historic Preservation Appeals Board, dedicated to hearing all appeals of the Houston Archaeological and Historical Commission. The appeals board consists of 5 members, 2 of which were former members of the Planning Commission, 2 former members of the Historical Commission, and a citizen representative that has not served on either commission. Other useful tools are design guidelines and design standards. Design guidelines are the city's best practice, and they're design parameters for development. They're adopted public statements of intent and are useful when evaluating a project's design. Keep in mind that design guidelines are advisory. Design standards are also design parameters. However, in this case, they are required. They are minimal acceptable standards that all projects are required to meet. We will be discussing these 2 tools in depth on our next webinar series. Vacant buildings can become a health and safety hazard to the community. They can diminish the overall quality of life of residents, neighborhoods, and visitors. Poorly maintained vacant buildings have a negative impact on the future of a city or neighborhood. They lower property values, pose a health and safety risk to neighboring properties, and create a negative impression that impacts the city's valuable tourism and convention industries. Empty buildings impose significant costs on all taxpayers by requiring additional code and police enforcement. They also have a higher incidence of code violation, criminal activity, and are vulnerable to fires. The vacant building program includes minimum maintenance requirements, registration requirements, penalties for noncompliance, etc. They can also include available incentives such as grants, loans, tax credit programs available locally for these properties. The standard of care for vacant buildings include minimum standards for exterior surfaces. It also requires the premises to be identified with a vacant building identification placard, maintenance of all exterior walls, roof, and drainage, decorative features, overhang extensions and awnings, stairwells, decks, porches, and balconies, chimneys and towers, handrails and guards, windows, skylight, and doors, as well as securing basement hatchways and windows. Another tool available to Texas CLG and Main Street cities is Downtown TX, an online building inventory for Texas downtowns featuring historic property listings. The concept arose from a focused initiative by the Texas Historical Commission to increase and influence the market exposure of available historic properties in downtowns across Texas. DowntownTX.org is unique in that it features 2 user interfaces, both running from a Google Map platform. The public interface, shown here, largely focus on showcasing investment opportunities. The administrative side offers Main Street managers and historic preservation officers a user-friendly way to store and display historic building information. This tool can be utilized by HPOs to keep track of their downtown resources, such as their status, vacant, occupied, for sale, for lease, etc., as well as storing historic research survey information and certificate of appropriateness applications. One of the goals of the software is to make your survey and inventory data more easily to manage and available to the public. Cities that have recently completed a survey of their downtown are perfect candidates for this program since the survey will be up to date with information. In addition to being able to show photos over time, fields like year built, historic designation, and survey priority are also visible to the public. The site officially launches May 1st, 2017 for Preservation Month, with about 18 cities going live and a series of property tours showcasing opportunities in the local markets. This is an evolving collaborative project guided by the Community Heritage Development Division of the Texas Historical Commission and the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission. Additional Texas Main Street cities and certified local government communities will be continually added through 2017. When fully populated, Downtown TX will showcase opportunities in hundreds of downtowns across Texas. To recap, a historic preservation ordinance must address the following sections. The purpose of the ordinance. It must establish the Landmark Commission and their duties. It must appoint a city historic preservation officer. It must establish a process for designation of local historic landmarks and districts. Establish a process on how to assign a different zoning designation to local landmarks and districts. Establish provisions for the certificate of appropriateness application. Establish how the ordinance will be enforced to protect the locally designated properties. Describe the path of appeal of a decision made by the Landmark Commission. And finally, the ordinance must address demolition by neglect and must include a 60-day stay on the demolition of designated historic properties. Thank you so much for watching this webinar on historic preservation ordinance. In the handout portion of the website, I have included links to some example ordinance from our COGs, as well as a few other articles and resources that discuss specific topics discussed today. Be sure to watch the rest of the Building a Strong Preservation Program webinar series, and feel free to contact us with any questions you may have. We're all here to help.